Hey everyone, I want to welcome you guys back to beer school today, since we're right in the middle of kind of transitioning from spring till summer. It feels like we've been in summer for a while now because the temperature's been nice, warm, and if you look back a couple of years, 100 years ago, 300, 400 years ago, this is the time that people would have started drinking more Saisons. And so Saison, or that original summer beer in southern Belgium, northern France, is what we're going to get into today. But before I get into the nuts and bolts of the beer tasting today, I want to say this is lastly our last YouTube beer school tutorial for you guys, maybe for a while. This has been a great opportunity for me to introduce myself and introduce the Beer Trap to a whole lot of new customers, to a whole lot of new people out there who may not be familiar with us during the quarantine period, during the COVID period. But starting this week, we're going to try to reopen the bar. That means my workload will certainly pick up some, my hours will expand more, and the ability to do this way may not exist going down the road. If that's the case, I hope you've enjoyed the last 14 or 15 of these episodes, and give me a shout, let me know what you think about them. Your encouragement may matter whether I carve out more time to do that in the future or not. But it's been a thrill to do these. It's got me out of my comfort zone a little bit. I'm not comfortable in front of the video. I'm more comfortable in front of a crowd. I'm more comfortable whenever I can see people. I can pick on people. I can see them laugh. I can see them pick at me. I like a running dialogue, and here seems too much like a tutorial for me. But I appreciate you putting up with me, letting me stumble through a lot of these. And it's really meant a lot to me that you follow me along this journey, so thank you so much. Okay, so getting back into actually the topic of today, we did certainly cross the threshold from spring to summer calendar-wise recently, but it does feel like we've been in the middle of summer for a very long time. Saisons are a type of beer that falls under an umbrella called farmhouse ales. Even though there's no real strict definition of what a farmhouse ale is, it's largely caught three different sub-styles in its shadow. One being the farmhouse ale. Sometimes with modern conversation pieces, we link farmhouse ales and Saisons to mean one unto the other. The truth is, the farmhouse ale is an umbrella, and the Saison is a part of that family. The other two beers that are part of that family is the French Bière de Garde. Those beers are kind of tied to the Saison culture, the Saison terroir, the Saison history, but they developed a little bit further to the south in France. You also have the Witz beers, which people don't normally associate with a farmhouse style, but it is a farmhouse style that was meant to be consumed fresher, quicker. It's a wheat beer, it's very perishable, so you want to be able to consume that very quickly. The Saisons were designed slightly differently. You got to keep in mind that a long time ago, before the microscope came along, before we really knew the fermentation science behind beer, we had largely allowed a lot of what happened with fermentation up to happenstance. Trial and error, century after century, kind of taught them a lot of rules and tricks of the trade. But really what they were doing, they would figure out eventually that you could not really brew during the summertime. The reason why is because there's too many mold spores, there's too many bacteria, there's too many things that wreak havoc on the fermentation process of summertime brewing. So a lot of brewers have said, well, let's just not brew then. Let's not waste the ingredients, let's not waste our time, let's not waste our resources, let's put our time to other things. So what you really had to do is you had to brew during the fall, winter, and spring whenever the brewer's yeast, or used to give you pleasant flavors, cleaner alcohol, had a tendency to have a more proper way of fermenting beer than those other microorganisms did, so the risk of contamination wasn't as strong. Well, if you fast forward till spring, all of a sudden you're looking around the barn, you're looking around the fields, and you're kind of saying, we have all this grain left over from the last fall's harvest. Let's go ahead and make a big batch of beer, because we know we're going to have to drink something through the summer, but we can't brew. So let's just go ahead and make a lot of beer and let it kind of store, and we'll drink them as time goes on throughout the summer. And so that led to the kind of Saisons that we know today. They'd make a stronger strength beer. Was pretty common for it to exceed 6-7% alcohol. Usually it didn't go into imperial status like 8%. They still needed these beers to be refreshing, crisp, clean, and not be too sweet, not be too heavy. Because keep in mind that these beers were designed that whenever the farmhands showed up that morning to work on the farms, they'd be given a plowman's lunch, and that lunch usually consisted of bread, cheese, and a quart of beer. So they sent them out to the field. They wouldn't see them until sunset usually, and so that would be what got them through the day. So you couldn't have anything too strong for them, or you have to compromise their work schedule, so you didn't want that either. So the beers were actually moderate in alcohol content. They usually dance between 4.5%, maybe 5% alcohol, up to right under 8%. So usually top off about 7-7.5% alcohol. One of the fascinating things about Saisons is how it deviates from what we normally associate being a properly made Belgian beer. Most Belgian styles usually pride themselves on having equal part fruit, equal part spice, and that all comes through the fermentation characteristics. No fruit, no spice were actually added to the beer, supposedly. But the Saisons have permission to vary a little bit from that. They have a tendency, because of that age, whenever the beer is first brewed in the spring, how it ages and it becomes very, very warm, with the bottle conditioning of the yeast actually in that bottle continuing to warm up. It continues to be aroused inside the bottle, continues to do its work far longer than most other strains of yeast will. So it has a tendency to eat more sugars and create more dryness. Has a tendency to create more bubbles. So it has a tendency to create more of that phenolic character or that spicy character naturally from the yeast. So these beers have permission to become a little spicier than fruity. They do have some fruit elements to them, but they're spicier. These beers also have a tendency to be more bubbly, more champagne-like, because carbonation continues to build as the temperature in Belgium would creep into the 80s, maybe even 90-degree temperatures inside the farmhouse. You're talking about a lowlands area that usually didn't have a whole lot of caves or a whole lot of cellars associated with them. So these beers might actually be stored in the barns, beside the goats, beside the chickens, and taking on that terroir characteristic. These beers also are the driest beers of all the Belgian families. Sometimes you can compare them a little bit more to a Belgian triple, but a drier Belgian triple. Because the brewers at that time kind of knew that hops had a natural medicinal process that kept them from spoiling, they took some extra liberties whenever it come to the hopping rates. Again, the hop harvest happened in the fall, so they may have had some extra hops left over. They're just going to use them all at that time. So these beers have a tendency to be a little bit more hop forward, a little bit more bitter, a little bit more grassier, a little bit spicier, have a little bit more of that bitter edge. And that bitter edge is facilitated by that lack of sweetness that the yeast has continued to ferment as the time has gone on throughout the summer inside the bottle. And so that's really the fascinating way that these beers came naturally. Now, we're going to start off by talking about Saison DuPont, because this is the beer style that most guidelines are written to basically define the quintessential taste of a Saison. And certainly there's no argument from me here. However, a lot of people, they hook, line, and sinker believe that this is the way every Saison should taste, and that's usually not true, or it should not be true. Turns out traditionally Saisons had a lot of variation in color, in strength, and flavor from going from farm to farm to farm. One of the big reasons for that is because each farm, being very far apart, may have a different terroir, and that terroir would make a certain yeast strain very vibrant in one area and not very vibrant in another. Remember, this is a time whenever you did not buy bottled yeast and actually add the yeast choice that you want. There's no way to design your beer. So you basically have to live with whatever is floating in the air, and whenever your beer was finished brewed, as that temperature would come down to support life, whatever yeast was in the air would create the fermentation character you get, and that would vary from farm to farm to farm, from valley to valley, from range to range, from stream to stream. So the characteristic of that farm would be very unique. The wine people call that terroir. And the beer world uses the same thing. We just don't use that word in that way as often, and we probably should, because that's the way beers were originally made as well. So this beer is a little bit on the cleaner side whenever it comes to a fauna characteristic from the yeast, and it has a very clean spiciness. It really accents the hops particularly well. These yeast spices do. The fruits in these beers are going to be a little bit of a light colored fruit, because this is a lighter colored beer. Usually golden color, usually insists that the fruit characteristics is going to be kind of lighter in its profile. Think of lemons, apples, maybe an under ripened orange, greener berries, grapes, pear, peach. Those kind of flavors can all be represented in some of these beers to some extent. But if you're looking to see what today's modern guideline says that Saison should taste like, it's going to be this beer. So Saison DuPont is the kind of the gold standard in what we talk about beers being today. But there's a lot of variation out there. For instance, like whenever the Inglesell Stiff brewery, this is a Trappist brewery, they make the Beano. Beano has a tendency to be a little darker, a little bit more honey-like, a little bit more sweetness associated with that, and still adhering to the guideline of being a Saison. So there's some variation there as well. Tank 7 is a Boulevard beer. This is actually a slightly more sterilized version than even the Saison DuPont, but still it hits the guideline really well, even though it tops out at 8% alcohol. It's a higher range of what we think a Saison should be nowadays. But this is a very good Saison, just because it's a little cleaner. It may be a slightly more simplified version of a Saison. Don't dismiss its quality, don't dismiss its complexity and its character. It's probably our most well-selling Saison from America. It's price point exceptionally well. Boulevard does a great job with this. Okay, so whenever it comes to the ingredients inside these beers, you're going to be looking at a lot of Pilsner malts, because that's actually what grew in the field. They were killing that stuff very lightly, so it didn't take on a whole lot of smoke character, or a whole lot of toasted characteristic, or a whole lot of caramelization from the sweetness. They really didn't want it to read a little bit more like a Pilsner, as the Pilsner became developed years after the Saison got established. But sometimes these beers would take on a smokiness. They would take on a darkness. They would be, today we think of like black Saisons, which is a brew pub variant you'll see sometimes, as being this new crazy thing that modern American microbreweries have developed. But the truth is, a dark Saison may have always been there. They're just reviving a style that had been dead for a very long time. And so, but Pilsner malt is usually what we start with. We're going to accessorize that malt profile with a little bit of wheat, maybe a little bit of oats, maybe some other grains. The reason why we do that is because these Saison yeasts have a tendency to over-attenuate the beer. In other words, create too much dryness and too much simplicity, too much, it becomes a thin beer if it ferments too high. The reason why we don't want that is because the carbonation comes out there so fast, because the carbonation doesn't have anything to embed itself into. It needs a malt profile or a malt body, some of that starchiness left over, to kind of give the beer some balance and hold on the carbonation so it doesn't go too flat too soon. So there's other grains like the wheat with the protein, also the oats with the protein, may be great grains to accessorize the Saison with, to give it a little bit of heft that just doesn't ferment away. So you can start with those grains. The hops are going to borrow a lot of hops from the Polish area and from the Germanic areas, and so the Saaz hops, the Tettnang hops, the Hallertau's, those hops you're used to seeing on the labels of German Pilsner are going to be the hops that they prefer in Saisons as well. It just may be more elevated in its character than what you're used to if you're drinking more simplified lagers. The water profile is going to vary quite a bit on these beers too. Remember, each farm probably had a different stream, and that stream probably had a different mineral content. The mineral content may be, some Saisons will be a little softer, some will be a little crisper, some of them you can actually taste the brewing salts naturally from the streams, even though none of those were actually added to the beer for flavor. So you get a lot of reasons why these beers have a different flavor. And don't dismiss the fact that one of the reasons why these beers may be different flavor is just the palate preferences of the people who worked and ran the farms. And that might be a big difference too, whether beer plays a little bit stronger, whether it plays a little lighter. It's just those conversations that probably took place, and all those influences shaped how these beers were to be defined on those farms. And so today we have a tendency to design our beers a little bit more deliberately, to pick our grains a little bit more deliberately, pick our water profiles, to pick our yeast choices, and so we can actually narrowly tell you what we think a Saison should be tasting like. But when you do that, you lose the artistry, you lose that rusticity, you lose that tradition a little bit of that happenstance, the way they made beers a long time ago. So all those were actually quite nice ways that the brewers would go about making beers that really did suit a certain flavor profile. They probably didn't even know that they were making a Saison. They just knew they were making a beer that with the ingredients and with the techniques they had on hand. Now moving along to some other varieties, those are a little bit more rustic varieties. You do have Jester King. They specialize in that old world way of making things. If you think about today's food culture, we're getting back to rustic bread making. We're getting back to more rustic cheese making, and all of our foods are getting back to maybe a little bit more traditional way of making things. We found that there's more nutrition, there's more flavor, there's more variance, there's just a little bit more character in the way we make those foods, and so beer is not exempt from that. Remember, beer is food. And so whenever we make beers nowadays, some brewers like Jester King say we want to get back to that. We want to be able to maybe pick our yeast a little bit, but pick yeast with some characteristics. Maybe we do want to see what kind of yeast profiles alive in our brewery, in our cellar rooms, that's outside of our brewery yards. Maybe we're going to dabble in that to try to figure out if there is a flavor here that we can use. And so Jester King is one that does that exceptionally well. Another brewery that uses a lot of barrel-aged treatments, along with some of that happenstance and that spontaneous fermentation characteristic, is Crooked Stave. And their Saisons, the VA, I have not seen this beer in quite a while. This is an aged version, 2013. There's no reason why these beers won't age particularly well, especially ones with a little bit more of the Brettanomyces, more souring agents. The beers will change over time, become maybe a little bit more of a sour ale, become a little bit more powdery, become a little bit more refined as it moves along. These beers are perfectly suitable for drinking fresh, but they will lay down for some time. Usually Saisons also have a couple of years, under rare exceptions, I think more than that. The Crooked Stave being one of them. Oxbow Brewery out of the Northeast is another brewery, and kind of the heartlands of the hazy IPAs. They say, no, we're going to stay true to our farmhouse traditions and make a beer that's a little bit more suitable to that old world way of making beers too. And they're very classic. Their Farmhouse Pale Ale is a beer that borrows some of the rusticity that you see in the Jester King and in the Fricassee, but also has a very familiar characteristic you get from the DuPont and maybe the Tank 7. So if you're looking for a happy medium world, this is probably it. Now, whenever you enjoy a Saison, it's almost impossible to enjoy one without grabbing you some really nice artistic breads, maybe a workman's bowl or a baguette, and grabbing some cheese. So whenever you're looking for a cheese for these beers, you can go a couple different directions. The tradition says, think of it like a triple. So get the Abbey washed rind stuff, those really extended age breeze, maybe a very light blue Gorgonzola or something like that. But I also like to think of, go get you a Romano, a Parmesan, a Reggiano type cheese. Asiagos, those really kind of earthy cheeses. They're hard, they're brittle, they have those little salt crystals in them. You bite into them, it's a little bit of Christmas morning because it was a surprise. You didn't think it was going to happen. There it is. So you get some of those flavors that really bounce off the flavors in there real well. You get some of that buttery sweetness of some of those cheeses that really accompanies the soft grain profile a lot of these beers have. You get the bitterness here and the sharpness of those cheeses that just dovetail quite nicely. So I like a lot of what's going on there. When you're looking at foods, you can actually go a little bit more delicate if you want to. You know, I've talked about chicken piccata and fish piccata, shrimp, scampies, and those kind of foods whenever it comes to beer fairings with a lot of the summer fare. This is no exception. This is really good too. But don't underestimate the power of this beer when it comes to traditional southern fried chicken. Just a crispy skin, the spices on that work real well with a beer like this. This beer is highly refreshing. You get the alcohol content and you get the bubbles. It really scrubs the fats off the palate so that every bite of food tastes as plentiful and as fresh as the first. Palate fatigue doesn't come into play so much. So get you some chicken wings, get you, or for my favorite is chicken thighs. So get you some southern fried chicken thighs and Saison and let that work in your favor particularly well. Dessert, something with like a crusty breadiness to it I really like, but also something with a fruit profile that maybe the beer is lacking or is subdued somewhat. So go with a good peach cobbler. Peach flavors can show up in these beers a little bit, but it's going to be a secondary, tertiary, or maybe even a nuanced characteristic that lurks in the background of flavor. The peaches in the peach cobbler is actually going to bring those flavors out. You can suit it for apple pie, you could do a rhubarb pie, or those kind of flavors as well. But I think peach is one of those examples that can work real well. These beers also have that grain profile that sometimes goes unnoticed to some extent, but whenever you get the crust of some of those pastry type, tarts type desserts, they can actually bring out that flavor of the beer even more and make a harmony and to help complete that story that we talk so much about. So I recommend that you go and grab some Saisons, whether here or somewhere else, and get busy with some of the beer and food pairings as you go along. Like I said, this is a bittersweet moment. I'm really looking forward to getting back to running this bar the way it's meant to be ran. However, I really enjoy these videos. I feel like I've grown up with you guys over the last couple of weeks, and I hope that I can work this back into a schedule. It's been a pleasure to talk with you guys about beer, and I hope to see you in here soon. So thank you.